Good morning and welcome to Respiratory System 1, the Conducting Zone Part 2. So hopefully you've listened to the Conducting Zone Part 1 where we looked at the nasal cavity. Now we're going to continue, actually we looked at the nasal cavity and the nasopharynx in the Conducting Zone Part 1. And now in Conducting Zone Part 2, we'll look at the oropharynx, the laryngopharynx, and the trachea. So if you look at the cartoon on the right, you can see the oropharynx is in pink. So structurally, the oropharynx is situated at the back of the oral cavity. So obviously your oral cavity is that cavity that we commonly call the mouth. And if you look at the cartoon, you can see this mid-sagittal section. You can find your mouth on the cartoon. You can see the tongue. See how thick that is, and all the muscles that attach the tongue to the mandible. And then if you go posteriorly from the tongue, you can see the soft palate. It's that piece of tissue that's hanging down from the roof of the oral cavity and the floor of the nasal cavity. And then you can, the word epiglottis in the cartoon did not come out, but if you find the tongue and you go posteriorly, you can see there's a flap of skin that's upward, that's moving upward or superiorly, and there's a line connecting to that, but then there's no word connecting to the line. That's the epiglottis. So when the epiglottis is folded down, that piece of tissue is folded down, it covers your larynx, or your aka your voice box, so that food will go posteriorly down into the esophagus. So the trachea is anterior to the esophagus, which is posterior. So the oral pharynx then, its borders are from the back of the oral cavity and the soft palate to a closed epiglottis. The oropharynx is lined with stratified squamous epithelium. So this is different from the nasal cavity and the nasopharynx that was lined with pseudostratified ciliated columnar cells with goblet cells. The oropharynx has stratified squamous epithelium, and you need a stratified squamous epithelium here, so you need a stratified epithelium in essence because food and air are passing through the oropharynx all the time. So food going from the oral cavity into the pharynx and on into the esophagus will sort of strip away the layers of the stratified squamous epithelium. So that's why you need that area to be a stratified cell layer. The oropharynx is protected by the palatine tonsil. So if you look at the cartoon, you can see there's a sort of a raised pink portion just inferior to the soft palate. That's the palatine tonsil. And then there's also a lingual tonsil. So lingual means makes a reference to the tongue. So just posterior to the tongue is the lingual tonsil. And again, the tonsils are part of the immune system. So from the oropharynx, pass into the final portion of the pharynx, which is the laryngopharynx. And the laryngopharynx, its border begins just posterior to a closed epiglottis. Now remember, in this cartoon, the epiglottis is open, so it's not closed in the cartoon. So the laryngopharynx begins just posteriorly to the epiglottis and ends at the cricoid cartilage. And we'll look at the cricoid cartilage on the next slide with the trachea, but the cricoid cartilage is just beneath the thyroid cartilage, and the thyroid cartilage is what is commonly known as the Adam's apple. So the laryngopharynx continues with a stratified squamous epithelium, just like the oropharynx, because again, food is passing from the oropharynx and the laryngopharynx into the esophagus. So you kind of get abrasion, a continuous abrasion when that bolus of food passes through these two parts of the pharynx. So then we get to the larynx, is the next structure before we get to the trachea. So the larynx is commonly called the voice box. Air passage, it's an air passageway to the trachea as well as the voice box, and it's made of 8 pieces of hyaline cartilage. So if you look at the cartoon, the hyaline cartilage is in blue, and then the larynx also consists of a piece of elastic cartilage, that's your epiglottis, and that's in pink. There's also many extrinsic and intrinsic muscles and ligaments that you don't have to know for the exam, but you can look at the names on the cartoon. For instance, if you look on the right side of the cartoon, in about the middle of the diagram on the left side, it says there is an arytenoid cartilage and an arytenoid muscle. So those cartilages and muscles, like I said, you don't have to know for the test, but just know that they are there. And the muscles and the cartilage aid in sound production. Like I said in the previous slide, the thyroid cartilage, so I'm looking on the left-hand side of the cartoon. You can see that the thyroid cartilage with a laryngeal prominence of the thyroid cartilage, that's commonly known as the Adam's apple. That's stimulated by testosterone at birth. So males generally tend to have a larger Adam's apple than females. And then just below the thyroid cartilage is the cricoid cartilage, and that signals the end of the laryngopharynx. And then that is also the upper border. The cricoid cartilage is also the upper border for the beginning of the trachea. And then we looked at the epiglottis on the previous slide. That's elastic cartilage, so it moves a lot, and it's when it closes, it's covering an internal space called the glottis. So in this cartoon, it doesn't label the glottis, but if you look on the right side of the cartoon and you find the vestibular fold, and then in parentheses it says false vocal cord, and then you find the vocal fold, in parentheses it says the true vocal cord, that little space between the vestibular fold and the vocal fold, that space is the glottis. So the glottis isn't a structure, it's a space. And then the epi, so epi means on top of, the epiglottis, when you're swallowing something, the epiglottis will move inferiorly and cover that space so that food doesn't go into your trachea, but rather food will go into your esophagus, which is posterior to the trachea. And then, like we just talked about, the larynx contains these vestibular folds and true vocal cords. So obviously the true vocal cords are the cords that produce sound. So now we're down into the tracheal part of the conducting zone. So if you look at this cartoon, you can see the little black and white drawing on the left side of a cross section through the trachea. And then what they did is they turned the cross section, they rotated the cross section so that it's let's see, it's 90 degrees. They rotated the cross section 90 degrees so you can look into the lumen of the trachea and you can see the esophagus, and the lumen of the esophagus, you can see that the esophagus is posterior to the trachea. And then you can see the trachea has at its posterior portion is a trachealis muscle. That muscle is smooth muscle. And then you can see the trachea is lined by pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. So you go back to the same type of cell membrane that you found in the nasal cavity. There's also seromucus glands in the submucosa, so just deep to the respiratory mucosa is a submucosa, and you've got some seromucous glands that can secrete both mucus and serous fluid. And then you have the hyaline cartilage that holds the trachea open. So because the trachea is lined with this pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium with goblet cells, if a particle gets into your trachea, there's the part of the trachea that can bring those particles superiorly or upward toward the throat is called a mucociliary escalator. So the cilia beat upwards in your trachea, and particles that get trapped in the mucus can be escalated up towards your mouth, where you can expectorate or cough those particles out, or you can swallow them and take them to an acidic stomach where hopefully most bacteria will be killed. Of course, smoking destroys these cilia, so it's hard to move the particles upwards, so that's why you have a smoker's cough. There's 16 pieces of hyaline cartilage that hold the trachea open. And I told you that the trachealis muscle is made of smooth muscle cells that can change, that can change the diameter of the lumen of the trachea. So when you cough, you can decrease the lumen of the trachea and increase the force from your abdomen. So you're going to increase the velocity of flow from the trachea out towards the oral cavity and the nasal cavity, so you can cough out whatever got caught in your trachea. And then when you do the Heimlich maneuver, probably most people know how to do the Heimlich maneuver. Find just below the xiphoid process and put your fist in there and give a hard pull or push, and hopefully pop out whatever's lodged in the trachea. So this part of the conducting zone is now from the trachea. We go into the bronchial tree. So from the trachea you go to the right and left primary bronchus through an area called a hilus in the lung. The right primary bronchus is shorter and more vertical, so if a piece of meat, say, that didn't get into the esophagus is going down the trachea, it will often get lodged in the right primary bronchus because it's shorter and more vertical. So you don't have to know the number of these bronchi, but just know that there are primary bronchi, secondary bronchi, and tertiary bronchi. And then as those tertiary bronchi get smaller and smaller, they become bronchioles. There's 23 orders of branching of bronchioles. And then at the end of the conducting zone, that's where you find the terminal bronchioles. And they're very small. They're 0.5 millimeters in diameter. And you get about 50 to 80 terminal branchings of terminal bronchioles. At this level of the terminal bronchioles, of course, you're still in the conducting zone, because there are no alveoli in the terminal bronchioles, so there's no chance for air exchange, gas exchange. At this level, the terminal bronchioles, you don't find mucus. There's no cartilage, but at this level, you find a lot of smooth muscle that will modify the airflow to the downstream bronchioles, which are called the respiratory bronchioles, which then lead to the alveoli, where you actually do gas exchange. The mucosa, the respiratory mucosa, now is not pseudostratified ciliated columnar. It's not stratified squamous. Rather, it's simple cuboidal in the terminal bronchioles. And then there's white blood cells there too, in order to stop any foreign invaders that got that far. If you do a bronchoscopy, then that's just taking a scope down to look at the bronchial tree.